The smell of chalk dust was the smell of Kate's life. It clung to her clothes, her fingertips, and the tired lines around her eyes. She wiped the last word from the blackboard with a damp cloth, smearing the lesson into a gray ghost. Cycles of revenge in ancient empires. She taught it every year. Grand, bloody histories of men who burned down the world for justice or for pride. Her own life felt so small in comparison. Her classroom was her kingdom, a quiet, orderly place of maps and timelines. Since the divorce, it was also her sanctuary. When the final bell rang and the students flooded out into the noisy afternoon, a profound silence would fall, a silence that felt just like her. She packed her canvas-tote bag with a stack of essays, the familiar weight a small comfort as she locked the door behind her. The walk to her favorite cafe was a ritual. Past the brownstones with their sleeping cats, past the bodega with its scent of roasted coffee and old newsprint. She ordered her usual, a black Americano and a corner table by the window. It was her safe space, a bubble of warmth and anonymity where she could lose herself in the work of others. She pulled out a red pen and got to work, correcting dates and circling grammatical errors, building a neat, orderly wall against the chaos she felt inside. She was 33, divorced, and felt more like a spectator in her own life than the main character. She wanted a spark, a jolt of meaning, something to prove she was more than just a history teacher grading papers in a quiet cafe. But she was cautious. She had learned the hard way that sparks could lead to fires. Then the sky broke open. A sudden, violent storm lashed against the cafe's large window, the rain coming down in sheets that blurred the world outside. The cozy warmth of the little shop suddenly felt fragile. Kate looked up from her papers, startled by the ferocity of it. Her gaze drifted across the street to the old church graveyard, its iron fence and gray tombstones slick with water. And that's when she saw him. He stood motionless in the downpour, a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit. The rain soaked through the expensive fabric, plastering it to his broad shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice. He wasn't seeking shelter. He was simply enduring. He was a stark, dark figure against the gray stone, a ghost haunting the living world. Her teacher's instinct was to look away, to give the man his privacy. Her cautious heart screamed at her to mind her own business. But she couldn't. Something about his stillness held her captive. As she watched, his shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. The sight was so raw, so utterly broken, it pierced through her carefully constructed walls. It was the most real thing she had seen in months. He was a stranger, a man drowning in a grief so profound he didn't even feel the storm. And in that moment, an empathy she thought she had buried deep inside her rose to the surface, powerful and undeniable, overriding all her fear. She left her half-finished coffee on the table. The decision was made before she was even aware of making it, a pull in her chest that was stronger than logic. She grabbed her worn umbrella from the stand by the door, the bell chiming softly as she stepped out into the cold, driving rain. The storm swallowed the sound instantly. The short walk across the street felt like crossing an ocean. Each step was a battle against the wind and her own better judgment. Turn back, Kate. This is not your business. But the image of his shaking shoulders was burned into her mind. She reached the iron fence of the graveyard and slipped through the gate. He didn't move as she approached, his focus entirely on a fresh mound of earth covered in dozens of white roses. Their petals were bruised and heavy with rain. Kate stopped beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't speak. She simply opened her umbrella and held it over them both, a small, fragile shield against the weeping sky. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain drumming against the nylon. He still hadn't looked at her. She could feel the cold radiating from him, a grief so profound it seemed to lower the temperature around them. Finally, she found her voice, keeping it soft so the wind wouldn't tear it away. "Can I help you?" He turned his head slowly, and Kate felt her breath catch. His face was all harsh angles and chilling control, but his eyes were wrecked. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into hell and brought a piece of it back with him. A flicker of hostility crossed his features, a warning to the stranger who had dared to enter his private agony. He was about to speak, to dismiss her with a cruel word, but then his gaze truly landed on her. He saw the genuine concern in her face, the absence of pity or fear. His jaw tightened, and he gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod toward the grave. Kate felt like an intruder. She had done all she could. "I'm sorry," she murmured, lowering the umbrella and taking a step back. She turned to leave, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. The quickest way back to the street was through the narrow alley that ran alongside the church. She ducked into it, eager to escape the charged silence of the graveyard. Shadows moved. 2 men materialized from a recessed doorway, blocking her path. They were large and menacing, their smiles thin and predatory. "Look what we have here," one of them rasped, stepping closer. "Lost, little lady?" Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. Her throat went dry. Before she could scream, a presence filled the alley behind her. The man from the graveyard was there. He hadn't run, he had simply appeared, a figure of absolute stillness in the swirling rain. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move a muscle. He just spoke their names, a low, dangerous sound that cut through the storm like a razor. "Dante. Marco." The change in the 2 men was immediate and total. The predatory smirks vanished, replaced by stark terror. They looked from Kate to the man in the suit as if seeing a king, or a killer. Without another word, they scrambled backward and vanished into the downpour. The alley was empty again. Kate stood trembling, her back pressed against the cold, wet brick. The man before her was no longer the broken soul from the graveyard. The grief was still there, a shadow in his eyes, but it was now wrapped in something else, an aura of terrifying authority. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm taking you home," he said. It wasn't an offer. It was a command, delivered in a voice that expected nothing but total obedience. It was the first time she felt the weight of his protection, and it felt dangerously like a cage. The public library was another kind of church for Kate. The silence was sacred, broken only by the soft rustle of turning pages and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. She sat surrounded by towers of books on the Byzantine Empire, trying to lose herself in the distant past. It was a deliberate attempt to erase the memory of the graveyard, of rain-soaked roses and a stranger's terrifying power. For 2 days she had managed to convince herself it was a strange, isolated fever dream. Then the dream walked in and sat down across from her. He didn't make a sound. One moment the chair was empty, the next he was there, filling the space with an energy that felt too big, too dangerous for the quiet room. He wore another dark, flawless suit, but today he looked less like a ghost and more like a predator. Kate's heart jumped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She slammed her book shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The librarian shot them a severe look over her glasses. "How did you find me?" Kate whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It wasn't difficult," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't belong among the dusty shelves. "Kate Sullivan. History teacher at Northwood Middle. Recently divorced. You live in the 2nd floor walk-up on Ashford Street." Every word was a stone, building a wall around her. He knew everything. She knew nothing, not even his name. The power imbalance was a physical weight pressing down on her. "What do you want?" "To thank you." He slid a long, white envelope across the polished oak table. It stopped just short of her trembling hands. "For your kindness." She stared at it, her mind racing. It was thick. It felt heavy with implication. Against her better judgment, she picked it up and opened the flap. Inside was a check. The number of zeros made her feel dizzy. It was more money than she had ever seen in one place, enough to erase her debts, to fix the leaky roof in her apartment, to start over completely. For a dizzying second, relief washed over her. Then came the shame, hot and sharp. He was trying to buy her compassion, to turn her simple human gesture into a transaction. It made her feel cheap. It made her feel small. She pushed the envelope back toward him, her hand steady now. "No," He blinked, a flicker of genuine surprise in his cold eyes. He clearly wasn't a man who heard that word often. It's a debt. I'm paying it. It wasn't a debt, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. It was an umbrella. I'm not for sale. His jaw tightened. He seemed thrown, a man whose primary tool, money, power, intimidation, had just been rendered useless. He stared at her, his gaze intense, searching. For a moment, the dangerous authority fell away, and she saw the man from the graveyard again, lost and uncertain. His hand went to his vest, fingers fumbling for something in his pocket. He pulled out a vintage silver pocket watch, the chain catching the light. He didn't look at the time. He just held it, his thumbs stroking the smooth, worn metal in a gesture that was unconsciously tender. It was my brother's, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. He was never on time for anything. I gave it to him as a joke. He finally looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was a raw, open wound. That was his grave. The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than any amount of money. Kate's anger dissolved, replaced by the same wave of empathy that had pulled her out into the storm. She saw the truth of him then, not a monster, but a man hollowed out by grief. He stood abruptly, pocketing the watch. The mask of control was back in place, but she had seen the crack in it. He gave her one last, lingering look before turning and walking away, his expensive shoes silent on the library's worn carpet. He disappeared as quietly as he had arrived, leaving Kate alone with the scent of rain and roses clinging to the air around her empty chair. His presence lingered long after he was gone. It was a ghost in her quiet apartment, a shadow that fell over her shoulder as she walked home from school. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The dark sedan parked at the end of her street, always the same one, its windows tinted so she couldn't see inside. The feeling of being watched as she bought groceries. She told herself it was paranoia, an aftershock from the encounter in the alley. But then the coincidences started. A brief glimpse of him across the street as she left the cafe. His car idling outside the library when she returned her books. He never approached, never spoke. He was just there, a silent, constant sentinel in her life. The safety she had felt in the alley curdled into something suffocating. He wasn't protecting her, he was possessing her. Her world, once small and orderly, now felt like a cage, and he was the one holding the key. The final straw came on a crisp Friday afternoon. She was leaving school, her tote bag heavy with weekend grading, when she saw him. He was leaning against the brick wall of the building opposite the school gates, watching the students pour out onto the sidewalk. He looked completely out of place in his perfect suit, a hawk among pigeons. He wasn't even pretending it was a coincidence anymore. This was a statement. Something inside her snapped. The fear she'd been nursing for days ignited into pure, hot anger. She was done being a ghost in her own life. She tightened her grip on her bag, marched across the street, and stopped directly in front of him. "Stop following me," she said, her voice low and shaking with fury. He didn't seem surprised. He simply pushed himself off the wall, his height towering over her. "I'm making sure you're safe." "Safe?" she scoffed, the sound sharp and bitter. "I feel like a prisoner. You have no right to invade my life like this. I don't even know your name." "Roman," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I don't care what your name is, Roman," she shot back, jabbing a finger at his chest. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to follow me and watch me and turn my entire world into your personal fishbowl. I helped you. That's all. I don't owe you anything." His expression hardened, but his eyes held something other than anger. It looked like desperation. He took a step closer, crowding her against the wall, his presence overwhelming. The noise of the city seemed to fade away, leaving only the tense, charged space between them. "You're wrong," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "You owe me nothing. I owe you everything." She stared at him, confused. "For an umbrella?" "No." He shook his head, the movement sharp and pained. He looked cornered, all his power and control stripped away, leaving only the raw grief she had seen in the graveyard. The pretense was gone. That day, I was gone. My brother was my entire world, and he was put in the ground. I was in a place so dark, I couldn't see a way out. All I had left was the rage. The need for vengeance. He paused, his gaze boring into hers, so intense she felt she couldn't breathe. And then you were there. He continued, his voice cracking. You didn't run. You didn't look away. You just stood with me. You were the only thing that broke through. The only human thing I had felt in months. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek. I am drawn to you, Kate, because you are the only light I have seen in a very long time. And I am trapped in the darkness. His confession struck her with the force of a physical blow. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a dizzying, dangerous mix of fear and a powerful, magnetic pull. This was no longer about a debt or protection. It was about a broken man clinging to the one person who had shown him kindness. His power was terrifying, but his vulnerability was a hook in her heart. And as he stood there, his tormented soul laid bare, she felt the undeniable spark she had been searching for. It wasn't safe. It was a fire. And she was standing far too close. His words hung in the air, a raw and desperate truth that left Kate breathless. The world around them, the schoolyard fence, the passing cars, the distant city hum, all faded away. There was only the heat of his presence and the chilling honesty in his eyes. Before she could process the pull she felt toward his pain, his expression shifted. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a grim, hard resolve. The men in the alley, he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. They weren't common thugs. They worked for a rival family. Kate's blood ran cold. What? My brother's grave is a sacred place. Roman continued, his gaze sharp and focused on her. To be seen there with me, offering comfort, they don't see that as kindness. They see it as a connection. They see you as my weakness. The word hit her like a punch to the stomach. Weakness. She, who had built her life around being careful and self-sufficient, was now a liability in a war she didn't even know was being fought. That's insane, she whispered, shaking her head. I had an umbrella. It doesn't matter what you were doing, he said flatly. It only matters what they saw. He took her arm, his grip firm but not painful. It wasn't a suggestion. Come with me. He led her to the black sedan that had been haunting her street. A driver with a face like stone stepped out and opened the back door for them without a word. The inside was silent and smelled of expensive leather, a sealed capsule moving through the city. Kate felt the barrier between her world and his dissolving completely. She was crossing over. The car pulled up to a building with no sign, just a black door and a velvet rope guarded by two men who were built like refrigerators. They nodded at Roman as he led Kate past the line and into the darkness. The change was dizzying. From the quiet of the car, she was plunged into a world of deep, pulsing bass that vibrated in her bones and flashing lights that cut through manufactured smoke. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and liquor. But it was the way people reacted to Roman that truly terrified her. A path cleared before them as if by magic. Men in sharp suits stopped their conversations to nod respectfully. Women with predatory eyes watched her with open curiosity, their gazes lingering on Roman's hand, which was now resting on the small of her back. She had never felt so exposed. This was his kingdom, and she was the strange, plain bird he had brought into his gilded cage. He guided her up a flight of stairs to a glass-walled VIP lounge overlooking the chaos of the dance floor. The music was a dull thud up here, allowing for conversation. The room was all black leather and chrome, filled with shadows and whispers. He led her to a secluded booth in the corner. He sat across from her, his face half hidden in the dim light. He was completely at home here, an apex predator in his natural habitat. By being seen with me, you have been marked, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. They know your name, where you work, where you live. They will try to get to me through you. Fear, cold and absolute, wrapped around Kate's heart. This was real. The men in the alley, the silent car, this dark, dangerous place, it was all terrifyingly real. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Roman leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. The intensity of his gaze was a physical force, pinning her in place. "Stay by my side," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the finality of a judge's sentence. "Let them see you are mine. Let them see that touching you means touching me. It's the only way you'll be safe." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a romantic proposal. It was a command disguised as a choice, a strategic move on a chessboard she never knew she was on. He was offering her protection, but the price was her freedom. He was offering her a cage, and the terrifying part was, she knew she had to walk right into it. The words settled in the space between them, heavy and cold as steel. "Stay by my side." It wasn't a choice. Kate knew that. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, locking her into this dark, violent world she had stumbled into. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The cage was gilded, but it was still a cage. Roman's posture relaxed slightly, the tension leaving his shoulders. He had won. He had secured his asset. He leaned back into the black leather, a flicker of something that wasn't quite relief in his eyes. Now that she had agreed, he owed her the truth. "My brother's name was Leo," he began, his voice flat and devoid of the raw emotion she'd heard earlier. This was a different kind of pain, one that had been sharpened into a weapon. "He wasn't like me. He was the light. He ran the legitimate side of our family's business. He was good." Kate listened, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She could picture a younger, smiling version of the man sitting opposite her. "They killed him 3 weeks ago," Roman said. The words were clipped precise. "A professional hit. 2 shots, clean, on his way home from a charity dinner. They left him on the sidewalk like he was nothing." He picked up a heavy glass from the table, swirling the amber liquid inside, his knuckles white. "They did it to send a message. To show that they could touch anyone anywhere." The coldness in his voice was more terrifying than any shouting would have been. This wasn't grief anymore. It was something else entirely. It was a vow. "Who?" Kate asked, her voice a dry whisper. "Viktor Petrov," Roman answered, and the name dripped with a venom so pure it seemed to poison the air. "He leads the Russian outfit. A butcher who clawed his way to the top over a pile of bodies. He and my father had a truce for 20 years. Viktor broke it the moment my father was in the ground. He wants our territory. He thought killing Leo would break me, make me fold." He took a sharp drink from his glass, the ice clinking like a funeral bell. "He was wrong," Roman said, setting the glass down with a definitive thud. "It didn't break me. It focused me. I'm going to burn his entire world to the ground. I will take everything he has, everyone he loves, and then, when he has nothing left but the air in his lungs, I will take that too." Kate stared at him, a profound chill seeping into her bones. The man she had offered her umbrella to, the broken soul weeping in the rain, was gone. In his place sat this creature of cold, meticulous vengeance. The empathy she felt for his loss was now tangled with a deep, primal fear of what that loss had turned him into. He wasn't just mourning. He was hunting. And she was now tied to the hunter. One of the men from the alley, the one Roman had called Marco, approached their table. He leaned in and murmured something in Roman's ear, his eyes flicking nervously toward Kate. Roman shook his head, his voice low and sharp. "No. The plan doesn't change. We move on Viktor's warehouses first." "But Roman, our people are saying it's too risky, too fast," Marco began, his voice tight with concern. "Then find me new people," Roman cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marco paled, gave a curt nod, and retreated into the shadows. Kate watched the exchange, her stomach twisting. Even his own men were afraid of this obsession. She looked into Roman's eyes, searching for the man who clutched his brother's pocket watch, but she couldn't find him. All she saw now was the flat, merciless gaze of a killer. She had offered a moment of comfort to a grieving man, and in doing so, had bound herself to a monster. The penthouse was a cage of glass and steel, suspended high above the city. Kate felt like a bird trapped in a display case. During the day, she watched Brooklyn move below her, a world she used to belong to, now distant and unreal. At night, the city lights were a cold, glittering carpet, beautiful and entirely separate from her. This was Roman's world, and she was just his prisoner, living in a gilded silence that was becoming deafening. He was a ghost in this magnificent home. He would return late, long after she had given up on sleep, the scent of the cold night clinging to his suit. He moved with a new, lethal purpose, his shoulders tight, his jaw perpetually clenched. The grieving man from the graveyard had been consumed by the hunter. He would disappear into his stark, modern office, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click that shut her out completely. One night, she couldn't bear the silence any longer. She found him standing before the floor-to-ceiling window in his office, staring down at the city he was planning to burn. He hadn't touched the dinner she'd left for him. "Roman," she said softly from the doorway. He didn't turn. "You should be asleep." His voice was flat, detached. She took a hesitant step into the room. "This isn't helping you. All this planning. It's not healing you. It's just feeding the anger." That made him turn. His eyes were like chips of ice. "What would you know about healing? I know that history is full of men who thought vengeance would make them whole again," she said, her teacher's voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "It never does. It just creates more ghosts. It's a cycle that never ends." A humorless smile touched his lips, a chilling, ugly thing. "You live in a world of books and theories, Kate. My world deals in blood and consequences. The only way to end a cycle is to be the last man standing." "And what happens then?" she challenged, stepping closer. "When you're standing alone in the ashes, will Leo be there? Will this pain finally go away?" His control snapped. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his presence so overwhelming she instinctively backed away until she hit the wall. He placed his hands on the wall on either side of her head, trapping her. He was close enough for her to see the terrifying emptiness in his eyes. "You think this is about my pain?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that vibrated through her. "This is about justice. It is the only law my world understands. A language you are not equipped to speak." He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her cheek. "You offered me kindness when I was weak. Do not mistake that for an invitation to tell me how to be strong." For the first time, she was truly afraid of him. This was the monster everyone else saw. The cold, ruthless authority who could make men vanish with a single word. The compassion she had felt for him felt naive, a foolish mistake made by a woman who didn't understand the darkness she was touching. He wasn't a man to be saved. He was a force of nature that would destroy everything in its path, including her. She flinched, and he saw it. A flicker of something, regret maybe, crossed his face before he masked it again. He pushed himself off the wall, turning his back on her as if she were nothing. "Go to bed, Kate," he said, his voice once again cold and distant. "You don't belong in here." She fled, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Back in the silent, beautiful living room, the city lights seemed to mock her. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she couldn't stop trembling. She had accepted his protection, walked into his cage, hoping to reach the broken man inside. But now she knew. The cage wasn't to keep others out. It was to keep the monster in. And she was locked inside with it. The return to her classroom felt like taking a breath after being held underwater for too long. The cold, silent luxury of the penthouse was a prison. This small room, with its scent of chalk and wood polish, was her freedom. It was parent-teacher conference night, a ritual she usually found draining, but tonight it was a lifeline. It was a reminder of who she was before Roman Jensen, Kate Sullivan, history teacher. A person with a purpose that had nothing to do with rain-soaked graves or men who dealt in vengeance. She sat at her desk, the familiar rhythm of the evening soothing her frayed nerves. Parent after parent came and went, a parade of worried, proud, and tired faces. She spoke of grades and homework, of participation and potential. It was real. It was normal. For a few hours, the shadow of Roman's world receded, and she felt like herself again. Her last appointment was for a boy named Nico Vasile. He was a quiet, watchful student who always did his work but never raised his hand. His file said his mother had passed away 2 years ago. The door opened, and a man stepped in, his shoulders slightly stooped as if carrying a great weight. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed with a deep weariness, but he offered her a polite, apologetic smile. "Mr. Vasile?" she asked, gesturing to the small chair opposite her desk. "Yes. Marco," he said, shaking her hand. His grip was firm. "Thank you for seeing me so late." The name pricked at her memory, a faint echo from a noisy, dark place. Marco. She was sure she had heard it recently, but she couldn't place it. She dismissed the feeling. It was a common name. "Of course," she said warmly. "Nico is a wonderful student. Very diligent." The man's face softened with a rush of paternal pride. "He's a good boy. But I'm worried about him. He's been so quiet since his mother." He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. "He keeps to himself. I feel like he's drifting away from me, and I don't know how to bring him back." Kate's heart went out to him. This was a good man, a father trying his best under impossible circumstances. This was the kind of problem she knew how to solve. It wasn't about blood and revenge. It was about connection and healing. "It's a difficult age, and he's been through so much," she said gently. "Sometimes all they need is a different way to connect." "Does he like to build things? Read?" They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He was earnest and listened intently to her advice, his gratitude genuine. He seemed like a man trapped by circumstances, trying to protect the one good thing in his life. As he gestured with his hands to make a point, her eyes were drawn to a thick silver ring on his finger, etched with some kind of crest or design. A jolt went through her, a powerful sense of déjà vu. She had seen that ring before. She was certain of it. She pictured it in a dark room, catching the flash of a light. In the nightclub. Standing next to Roman. Her blood went cold. She looked from the ring back to his face, the worried eyes, the tired smile. It was him. It was the man from the alley. The man Roman had ordered around in the VIP lounge. Marco. He was oblivious to her internal shock. He was just a father, thanking his son's teacher. "Thank you, Miss Sullivan. Really. This helps." He stood to leave, his expression lighter than when he had walked in. Kate could only nod, her throat suddenly too tight to speak. He was one of them. This kind, worried man was part of Roman's violent world. And his son, her quiet, grieving student, was part of it too. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Kate sat frozen at her desk in the empty classroom. The illusion of her safe world had just shattered completely. The two halves of her life, the teacher and the prisoner, had just collided. Roman's darkness wasn't just in his penthouse. It was here, sitting in a child-sized chair in her classroom, wearing the face of a loving father. Roman's rage had a sound. It was the sound of a heavy glass being slammed onto his marble desk, the sharp clink of ice against crystal, the low, frustrated growl that came from his chest. For 2 days, that sound had been the soundtrack to Kate's life in the penthouse. His hunt had hit a wall, a solid, immovable brick wall, and the force of his anger was ricocheting around their gilded cage, making the air thick and hard to breathe. She watched him from the doorway of his office. He was pacing like a caged panther, his perfect suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. He radiated a dangerous, directionless fury. The rival family, the Petrovs, had an alibi. Airtight, his men had told him. Impossible to break. Before meeting Marco Vasile in her classroom, Kate would have hidden from this storm. She would have made herself small and silent, waiting for it to pass. But the image of that worried father's face, of his quiet son, had changed something fundamental inside her. This wasn't an abstract cycle of violence anymore. It had a face. It had a name. Nico. And she could not stand by and watch Roman burn down the world, knowing a child from her classroom could get caught in the blaze. She took a breath and stepped into the office. "They didn't do it," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the tense silence. Roman stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes blazing. "What did you say?" "The Petrovs," she clarified, her heart hammering against her ribs. She refused to let him see her fear. "They didn't kill your brother." He let out a short, harsh laugh. "And what makes you the expert? A chapter in one of your history books?" The condescension in his voice stung, but she stood her ground. "Exactly. My history books." Her gaze fell on a small piece of chalk she'd unknowingly carried home in her pocket, a nervous habit from cleaning the blackboard rails. She pulled it out, the simple white stick feeling like a weapon in this world of steel and glass. She walked to the dark, polished surface of his conference table. "You're a king, Roman. This is your kingdom." With a steady hand, she drew a large, crude circle on the table. The white dust was a shocking violation of the pristine surface. He watched her, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You're looking for a foreign invasion," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "An attack from the outside. You're scanning the borders for enemy armies." He said nothing, just stared at the circle, his jaw tight. "But history teaches us something else," she said, looking directly at him. "It teaches us that the greatest empires don't fall to invaders. They rot from the inside. Caesar wasn't killed by a foreign king. He was stabbed by his own senators. By his own friends." She pressed the chalk into the center of the circle and drew a sharp, definitive X. "The most fatal wounds, the ones you never see coming, are the ones that come from within." The silence that followed was absolute. The air crackled with tension. Roman stared at the chalk mark, then his gaze lifted to her face. The raw rage in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dawning, chilling consideration. She had given his fury a new direction. She had handed him a new, more terrible possibility. He was a man blinded by grief, looking for a monster he already knew. She had just suggested the monster might be sleeping in his own house. Her logic was simple, brutal, and undeniable. He slowly walked to the table, his eyes never leaving hers. He ran a finger over the chalk dust, his expression unreadable. He was intrigued. More than that, he was listening. For the first time, he wasn't looking at her as a teacher, a civilian, or a weakness. He was looking at her as an equal. "You want to look at my records," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I want to find the truth," she countered. A long moment passed. He studied her, a king considering the words of a strange new advisor. Finally, he gave a curt, decisive nod. "Fine." He gestured to the sleek, encrypted laptop on his desk. "Show me." The only light came from the blue glow of the massive screen, casting long shadows across Roman's stark office. The city slept below them, a sea of distant, silent lights. For hours they worked. The silence in the room was no longer a weapon or a wall. It was a shared space, a bubble of intense concentration. Kate sat at his desk, her posture straight, her focus absolute as she scrolled through digital security logs, personnel rosters, and financial transfers. She wasn't a hacker. She wasn't looking for a hidden line of code or a secret file. She was a historian, searching for the subtle cracks in the official story. An employee who clocked out 2 minutes early. A supply truck that took an unusual route. The small, human inconsistencies that technology often overlooked but history always remembered. Roman didn't pace. He didn't drink. He sat in the chair beside her, watching. His usual restless energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He watched her fingers move across the keyboard, watched her eyes scan the lines of data, a small frown of concentration on her face. Kate could feel his gaze on her, but it wasn't the possessive, watchful eye of her protector. It was different. It was the look of a commander studying his most unlikely strategist. He was impressed. He was trusting her. The hours bled together. The blue light of the monitor made her eyes ache. She finally leaned back, rubbing her temples with a sigh. Anything? Roman's voice was low, rough from disuse. Not yet, she admitted. It's all too perfect. Too clean. That's what's wrong with it. He stood and walked to a small, hidden bar in the corner of the office, returning with 2 glasses of water. He placed one beside her, a simple gesture that felt profoundly intimate in the dead of night. As he sat back down, his hand went to his vest pocket, and he pulled out the silver watch. The habit was as unconscious as breathing. He opened the cover, not to check the time, but just to look at its face. He was going to be late for his own wedding, Roman said, his voice soft, a ghost in the quiet room. If he ever had one. He was always running 5 minutes behind the rest of the world. Kate turned to look at him. His face, illuminated by the screen, was stripped of its harshness. He looked younger, sadder. We were at Coney Island, he continued, his thumb stroking the edge of the watch. Leo must have been 16. He spent his entire allowance trying to win this huge stuffed bear for a girl he liked. He was 1 ball away when the park closed. He begged the guy to let him have one more throw. Held up the entire crew for 20 minutes. A small, sad smile touched Roman's lips. He didn't get the bear. He got yelled at by our father. But the girl kissed him anyway. He snapped the watch shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the office. He was an idiot. A hopeful, trusting idiot. And that's probably what got him killed. Kate's heart ached. This wasn't a story about a victim. It was a story about a boy who tried to win a stuffed bear. It was a story about a brother. In that moment, the line between them blurred into nothing. She wasn't his prisoner or his project. He wasn't her protector or her captor. They were just 2 people in a dark room, haunted by a ghost. She reached out and gently placed her hand over his on the desk. His skin was cold. He flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. We'll find out who did it, Roman, she said, her voice full of a conviction she didn't know she had. We'll find the truth. He looked from her hand to her face, and the last of his armor seemed to crumble. He saw no pity in her eyes, only a fierce, shared resolve. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His grip was firm, a silent acknowledgement. An agreement. They were partners now, an alliance forged in shadows and grief. She turned back to the screen, his hand still holding hers, and got back to work. The warmth of his hand holding hers was a steady anchor in the sea of data. It kept her grounded as the hours passed, as the lines of code began to blur into a meaningless river of green text. Kate felt a kinship with the Roman beside her, the quiet man sharing a memory, not the king who ruled a violent empire. It made her want to solve this for him, to find the piece of the puzzle that would finally let him breathe. She was looking for a ghost. A flicker in the system, a shadow that didn't belong. And just as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the sky, she found it. It wasn't a dramatic error. It was a single, insignificant security log from an access road 2 blocks from where Leo was killed. A patrol car had been rerouted. The log said it was for a reported gas leak, but there was no corresponding report from the city. The reassignment had lasted for exactly 5 minutes, creating a blind spot in their network. It was the 5-minute window when Leo's car had driven down that street. Roman, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He straightened instantly, his focus sharpening. His hand tightened on hers. What is it? A ghost car, she said, pointing to the screen. A patrol was pulled from this street right before Leo arrived. The reason is falsified. Her heart began to beat faster. This was it. This was the crack in the story. It was an override order. It had to be someone high up. She clicked through the encrypted files, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The system was designed to protect the chain of command, to make every order traceable. She found the override log, a single line of text buried deep in a maintenance file. She clicked it open. The digital signature was clear, stamped with a precise time code. Override order M. Vasile. The name meant nothing to her beyond a faint echo from the nightclub. But to Roman, it was everything. Kate felt the change in him before she saw it. A sudden, violent stillness. The warmth in his hand vanished, replaced by an arctic cold that seemed to leach the heat from her own skin. He released her hand and leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowed on the two words. Vasile. The color drained from Roman's face, leaving it a pale, taut mask of disbelief. He stared at the name as if he could burn it off the screen with the force of his gaze. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. This wasn't the cold, calculating rage he had held for Viktor Petrov. This was something else. Something broken and far more terrifying. It was the white-hot, sickening shock of a man who had just been stabbed in the back by his own family. Marco! He breathed, the name a shard of glass in his throat. He was Leo's best friend. He was my father's most trusted man. Kate watched him, a profound chill running down her spine. The man from the alley. The man who had seemed so concerned for Roman's reckless path. He was a traitor. Roman pushed himself away from the desk and stood, turning his back to her. He walked to the window and stared out at the rising sun, but he wasn't seeing the city. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The grief that had been a smoldering fire was now a raging, uncontrolled inferno. An enemy you can understand, he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to shake the very glass of the window. An enemy wants what you have. Your money, your territory. That's business. You fight, you win or you lose. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her want to run. The lost, grieving man was gone. The cold king was gone. In their place was a judge, a jury, and an executioner. But a traitor, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, raw with a fury that was absolute. A traitor is a sickness in the blood. They smile at your table while they poison your wine. You don't fight a sickness, Kate. You cut it out. You burn it away before it infects everything you love. His code was clear. An enemy was a matter of strategy. A traitor was a sin that demanded erasure. The hunt for Viktor Petrov was over. A new one had just begun, and its justice would be swift, personal, and without mercy. The air in the office was thick with the promise of death. Roman moved with a chilling, mechanical purpose, the fire of his rage now cooled into a block of ice. He was no longer a man grieving, he was an engine of retribution. Kate stood frozen by the desk, a spectator to a verdict that had already been delivered. He strode to a locked filing cabinet, the key turning with a sharp, metallic click that echoed the snap of his control. He pulled a single manila folder from the drawer and walked back to his desk, tossing it onto the polished surface. The name on the tab was typed in stark black letters, Vasile Marco. This was it. The final piece of paperwork before a man was erased. He has a family, Roman said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was a statement of fact, not a consideration of mercy. We'll make it look like an accident. Clean. They won't be touched. He opened the folder. The first page was a personnel sheet, a list of dates and promotions and commendations that now meant nothing. Clipped to the top corner was a photograph. Kate's eyes were drawn to it, a small square of color in a world of black and white. It was a slightly faded family photo, the kind taken at a department store studio. A woman with a warm, gentle smile stood beside a man. And between them, a small boy with serious, dark eyes. Kate's breath caught in her throat. Her world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just Marco, Roman's traitorous lieutenant. It was Mr. Vasile. The polite, worried father who had sat in the small chair across from her desk. The man whose handshake was firm, whose gratitude for her advice had been so genuine. She could still see the tired lines around his eyes, could still hear the concern in his voice as he spoke about his quiet, struggling son. Her gaze snapped to the boy in the photo. Nico. her student. The watchful child who never raised his hand, the boy who was drifting in the lonely sea of his grief. The boy she had promised his father she would look out for. The blood drained from her face, a cold tide pulling all the warmth from her body. The connection clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. This wasn't an abstract problem anymore. This wasn't a history lesson about empires and traitors. This was about a child. A child who sat in the third row of her classroom, who was already missing his mother, and whose father was about to be executed by the man holding her hand just an hour ago. Roman's justice was going to orphan her student. His need to cut out the sickness was going to create a wound in a child's life that would never, ever heal. The two halves of her life, the quiet, orderly world of a teacher and the dark, violent cage of Roman's protection, had just collided with the force of a car crash. The conflict was no longer about Roman's soul, or her safety. It was about Nico. It was about the promise she'd made to a worried father. It was about her duty, not as Roman's confidant, but as a teacher. Roman picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over a number on the screen, completely oblivious. He was about to give the order. He was about to destroy a family she knew, a child she was sworn to protect. And in that terrible, silent moment, Kate knew she could not let it happen. She could no longer be a spectator. She had to stand between the monster and the child. Don't. The word was a choked whisper, but it sliced through the deadly quiet of the office. Roman's thumb froze over the screen of his phone. He looked up at her, his face a mask of cold stone, his eyes holding no recognition of the woman who had held his hand just an hour before. It was as if a door had slammed shut inside him, locking away everything but the ice. "This has nothing to do with you, Kate," he said, his voice flat. "It has everything to do with me." Her voice cracked, fear and desperation making it sharp. She pointed a trembling finger at the photo on his desk. "That boy Nico. He's my student. He sits in the third row, and he hasn't smiled since his mother died. Do you understand? He is my student." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed Roman's face. "Then you should be grateful. I'm making it clean. It will be an accident. The boy won't have to see anything." The sheer coldness of his logic stole her breath. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a force of nature, a glacier moving to crush everything in its path, and he saw a child's broken heart as mere collateral damage. The empathy she had clung to, the hope that she could reach the grieving man inside, it all turned to ash. "You can't do this," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Roman, please. This won't fix anything. It will just create more pain. It will make you a monster." "I am what this world made me," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He finally looked away from her, his gaze turning to the window, to the church spire barely visible in the distance. "I'm meeting him tonight. At St. Michael's." Kate's blood ran cold. The church. The graveyard. The place where Leo was buried. The place where she had offered him her umbrella. "It's only right," Roman continued, a chilling finality in his tone. "The betrayal ends where the grief began." He slipped his phone into his pocket, the order not yet sent but already sealed. He walked to the office door, pausing with his hand on the handle. He looked back at her, his eyes empty. "You will stay here. Dante will be outside the door. Do not try to leave." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft, definitive click. She was a prisoner again, but this time, the bars felt real. She ran to the door and twisted the handle. Locked. She could hear the heavy presence of the guard, Dante, on the other side. She was trapped. Panic seized her, hot and sharp. He was going to do it. He was going to orphan that quiet little boy, and he was going to destroy the last piece of his own soul in the process. She wouldn't let it happen. She couldn't. She scanned the office, her mind racing. The windows were sealed, a sheer drop to the city below. There was no escape. Her eyes landed on the penthouse's main door, visible down the long, marble hallway. Dante was guarding the office, not the entire apartment. It was a long shot, a desperate, foolish plan, but it was the only one she had. She took a deep breath, walked back to the desk, and picked up the heavy crystal glass Roman had slammed down earlier. She took a step back and hurled it against the thick window overlooking the city. It didn't break, but the impact was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent penthouse. She heard Dante swear outside the door, followed by the sound of him fumbling with his keys. "Ms. Sullivan? What was that?" The lock clicked. The door swung open. Dante stood there, his gun half drawn, his eyes wide with alarm as he stared at the window. That was her chance. She didn't hesitate. She bolted, sprinting from the office and down the hallway toward the main entrance. Dante shouted her name, his heavy footsteps pounding on the marble behind her. She was fueled by pure adrenaline, her only thought the image of Nico's sad, serious face. She fumbled with the complex lock on the front door, her fingers clumsy with fear. She heard Dante getting closer, felt the air move as he reached for her. The lock clicked open. She threw the door open and plunged into the hallway, slamming the heavy door behind her. She didn't wait to see if it would hold him. She just ran. She flew down the emergency stairs, her footsteps echoing on the concrete, the sound a frantic drumbeat of desperation. She burst out of a service door into a back alley, the sudden cold air a shock to her lungs. Rain had begun to fall again, a cold, sharp drizzle that slicked the pavement. The city lights blurred around her as she ran, a smear of color and noise. Her lungs burned. Her legs ached. She didn't care. She hailed the first taxi she saw, its yellow light a beacon in the wet darkness. "St. Michael's Church," she gasped, climbing inside. "On Grand Street. Please hurry." The driver took one look at her wild eyes and rain-soaked clothes and hit the gas. The car sped through the glistening streets of Brooklyn. Every red light was an agony, every second a lifetime slipping away. She pressed her face against the cold glass, watching the city fly by, praying she wouldn't be too late. Finally, she saw it. The dark stone steeple rising against the night sky. The church stood silent and imposing, an ancient sanctuary about to become a place of execution. The graveyard beside it was a field of shadows. A single black car, Roman's car, was parked at the curb. Through the tall, arched windows, she could see a faint, flickering glow. Candlelight. He was in there. The taxi screeched to a halt. Kate threw a handful of crumpled bills onto the front seat and scrambled out, not even waiting for it to stop completely. She ran across the wet street, her heart a wild, terrified bird in her chest. She had to stop him. She had to stand between his vengeance and that little boy's future. She reached the massive oak doors of the church and pushed. They swung inward, opening into a cavern of shadows and flickering light, and the scene that would change her life forever. The heavy church doors groaned open, the sound echoing into the vast, silent space like a desecration. Kate stood on the threshold, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, rain dripping from her hair onto the cold stone floor. The air inside was thick with the scent of melting wax and ancient, polished wood. Hundreds of candles flickered from the pews and along the altar, their small flames dancing and casting long, trembling shadows that writhed up the stone pillars to the vaulted ceiling. It was a beautiful, terrible sight. And at the heart of it, at the foot of the altar, was the scene she had run through the city to prevent. Marco Vasile was on his knees, his face pale and streaked with tears in the candlelight. He looked broken, a man who had already accepted his fate. Standing over him was Roman, a figure of absolute, chilling judgment. He was no longer the man from the office or the graveyard. He was an avenging angel carved from ice and shadow. In his right hand he held a gun, its dark metal absorbing the light. On the stone floor near his feet, glinting in the glow, lay the silver pocket watch. A fallen symbol of a shattered brotherhood. Her entrance had frozen the moment. Both men turned to look at her, their expressions stark in the flickering light. Marco's face was a mask of disbelief and a flicker of desperate, impossible hope. Roman's was pure, undiluted fury. "Get out, Kate!" he commanded, his voice low and lethal, a sound that promised consequences. She didn't move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner in her own chest, but her feet were rooted to the spot. No! She took a step forward, then another, her wet shoes making soft, slapping sounds on the stone. The sound was an intrusion, an announcement that her world was now colliding with his. She walked slowly, deliberately, down the central aisle, her eyes locked on Roman's. She didn't look at Marco. She didn't look at the gun. She looked only at the man she had met in the rain. I told you to stay out of this. Roman snarled as she drew closer. You don't get to decide that anymore, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She stopped just a few feet away, placing herself directly between Roman and his kneeling traitor. She could feel the heat of the candles on her skin, could feel the cold radiating from Roman. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging for a man's life. She was delivering a sermon of her own, one written in scars. I'm not talking to the man holding the gun, she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying through the cavernous space. I'm talking to the man who stood in the rain because he didn't know where else to go. I'm talking to the man who couldn't breathe from the weight of his own grief. Look at me, Roman. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line, but his eyes, for a fraction of a second, wavered. You came into my life because I showed you a moment of compassion, she continued, her voice gaining strength. Are you going to use that moment to create a lifetime of pain for a child? Does honoring your brother mean destroying another boy's father? She saw his grip tighten on the weapon. He was resisting, fighting to hold on to the cold rage that fueled him. His name is Nico, she pressed on, refusing to let him look away. He is quiet, and he is sad, and he misses his mother every single day. His father is all he has left. Is this the legacy Leo would want? For his memory to be the reason another child is left alone in the dark? Her words were arrows, each one aimed at the cracks in his armor, the cracks she herself had witnessed. The man who clutched a pocket watch, who remembered a boy at Coney Island, who had been drawn to a stranger's kindness. This is not justice, Roman. It's a plague. And it will rot you from the inside out until there is nothing left of the man your brother loved. She took one final, defiant step forward, her gaze unflinching. I stood with you in your darkest moment. You will not use my kindness as the spark that burns down another family. My compassion is not your excuse to become this. The final word hung in the air, an indictment and a plea. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of 100 candles. Roman stared at her, his face a war of emotions, the cold fury of the betrayed brother warring with the haunted eyes of the grieving man she had saved. Her integrity was a shield against his vengeance, and for a long, terrifying moment she didn't know which would break first. The world held its breath. The only sound was the faint, soft sputter of candle wax. Kate's words hung in the charged air, a fragile shield against the cold metal of the gun in Roman's hand. She watched his face, searching for any sign that she had reached him, that the man she'd met in the storm was still in there somewhere. His knuckles were white around the weapon, his entire body a knot of violent tension. He looked from her resolute face to Marco's pathetic, crumpled form on the floor. His gaze then dropped to the silver pocket watch, its face reflecting the flickering light of a dozen tiny flames. It was a piece of his brother, a piece of his past, lying on the cold stone between vengeance and mercy. Kate saw the war in his eyes. The killer who demanded blood wrestled with the brother who had loved a hopeful, trusting idiot. The cycle of revenge she had taught in her classroom was no longer a historical theory. It was a choice, happening right here, right now. Slowly, as if moving against a powerful current, he lowered his arm. The gun, which had been aimed at Marco's head, now pointed at the floor. The sound of Kate's own breathing rushed back into her ears, loud and shaky. He hadn't fired. Roman took a step back from Marco, his expression still a mask of cold fury. He hadn't forgiven him. Kate knew this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about something more profound. He looked down at the man who had betrayed him, his voice a low, chilling command. "Get your son!" Roman said, the words like chips of ice. Pack a bag. You have 1 hour to be out of this city. If I ever see your face again, if I ever hear your name spoken in my territory, I will not hesitate. Now get out of my sight!" Marco scrambled to his feet, stumbling backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He didn't look at Kate. He couldn't. With a choked sob, he turned and fled, his footsteps echoing as he disappeared into the darkness of the church entrance. And then they were alone. The danger was gone, but the silence that remained was heavier, filled with the weight of everything that could never be. The massive, unbridgeable chasm between their worlds was laid bare in the candlelight. Roman turned to her. The monster was gone, but the king remained, a man defined by the shadows he commanded. He took a step toward her, his expression unreadable, a mixture of gratitude and profound loss. He knew what she had done. She had saved him from himself, but in doing so, she had proven that they could never truly be together. To be with him was to be forever on the edge of this violence, to live in a world where justice was delivered at the end of a gun. Kate held her ground. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For the safety you gave me. I will never forget it." He stopped, understanding her meaning instantly. This was goodbye. "I can protect you, Kate. I can give you anything." She shook her head, tears finally welling in her eyes, blurring the candlelight into a galaxy of broken stars. "You can't give me this," she said, gesturing to the empty church, to the world outside its doors. "You can't give me a life where I don't have to be afraid of who is knocking on the door. I can't live in your world, Roman. I have to be free." Her choice was made. He saw the finality in her eyes. He, a man who took whatever he wanted, could not take this. He could not own her light. He could only stand in its warmth for a short time. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, the most profound defeat he had ever suffered. Kate took a step backward, then another, pulling herself away from his magnetic field. She held his gaze for one last, heartbreaking moment, memorizing the face of the grieving man and the dangerous king, two halves of a person she could never fully know. Then she turned her back on him, on the candles, on the ghost of his brother, and walked out of the church, leaving him alone in the silence and the shadows. 6 months later, the smell of chalk dust was just the smell of her classroom. It no longer felt like a shield or a sanctuary. It was simply a part of a life she was actively living. Kate moved between the rows of desks, her steps confident, her voice clear as she spoke about the fall of Rome. The cycles of revenge in ancient empires were still on her syllabus, but now, she taught the lesson with a different kind of authority, an understanding that went far beyond the pages of a textbook. She was no longer a spectator to history, or to her own life. Her world had found its rhythm again, a quiet, steady beat that was all her own. She graded papers in her corner of the cafe, but now she also met friends for dinner. She walked home through the Brooklyn streets without looking over her shoulder. The dark sedans were gone. The feeling of being watched had vanished. The cage had disappeared, and she had simply learned to fly again. Roman Jensen was a ghost, a memory that surfaced only in the quietest moments, a story she would never tell. During her lunch break, she scrolled through the news on her phone, a quiet moment of peace in the bustling teacher's lounge. Her thumb stopped on a headline from a local news site. "Massive anonymous donation secures future for Brooklyn Children's Charity." She almost swiped past it, but something made her click. The article described an unprecedented, multi-million-dollar gift made to a small, struggling organization. Kate's heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt as she read its name, the Leo Jensen Foundation for Children of Violent Crime. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a new charity, one she had never heard of. The article explained it had been established to provide counseling, education, and safe housing for children who had lost a parent to violence. Anonymously funded, of course. But she knew. She knew with an absolute certainty that went deeper than logic. It was him. It was his answer to her sermon in the church. He hadn't just spared one child. He was trying to save them all. A small, sad smile touched her lips. He had listened. Her act of compassion hadn't just stopped his destruction, it had been a seed. And in the darkness, it had grown into something new. That afternoon, as she left the school, the late autumn sun was casting long shadows across the pavement. Her life was her own again, orderly and full of a quiet meaning she had built for herself. She walked to her car, her mind on the groceries she needed to pick up, the essays she still had to grade. The simple, wonderful mundanity of it all. And then she saw it. Resting against the driver's side windshield wiper was a single, perfect white rose. Its petals were flawless, pearlescent in the fading light, a stark and beautiful slash of white against the glass. It was the same kind of rose that had covered his brother's grave, the kind that had been soaked in the rain on the day their two worlds collided. She stopped, her hand hovering just above it. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a final, silent acknowledgement. A ghost's touch. It was not a promise or a plea. It was goodbye. Kate carefully picked up the flower, its stem cool against her fingertips. She looked up and down the quiet street, but there was no one there. Roman Jensen was gone, a shadow that had passed through her life and disappeared back into the night. But he had left an echo behind. An echo of kindness. She was free, but she was forever marked by the darkness she had touched. And as she stood there, holding the impossible flower under the Brooklyn sky, she knew with a deep and unshakable certainty that she was not defined by his darkness, but by her own enduring light. If you enjoyed the video, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our content.